opportunity to worship from you. Today's going to be a very
Thinking about it, I remember my very first day of in freshman year biology class. Anybody young enough? Yeah, you all are. To remember your biology class. Well, my biology class, first year, first day, Pittsfield High School. My teacher, Mr. Olch, he kicked us off this day with a question. He asked this question. He said, "Who here believes the Bible story of creation, that God created the world?" This was the 80s, and you could ask these kinds of questions of your students in public school. And so I raised my hand, and so did one other girl on the other side of the room who was not really a cool girl to associate with, and no one else. And this surprised me. I didn't realize I was the only one of my friends who believed this. I raised my hand, for one, because I do believe in the Bible's story that God created the world. I just didn't think I was alone in that. I mean, it was not something that we ever really talked about, my friends and I, in ninth grade. We weren't really delving into the origins of existence. We were just trying to get girls to recognize our existence, right, at that age. But I realized quickly that I had miscalculated, because not only was I out there on an island, but the class burst out in laughter, because you could also do that in the 80s. I think there was finger pointing. My friends wouldn't look at me in the eyes for days there. And Mr. Olch went on from that moment. He then said, well, if you believe that, keep it to yourself. I thought that was aggressive. Even at you're 14 years old, that seemed a little odd. He went on, he said, in my classroom, I teach evolution. Teachers, as well as some of my Bible teachers, a line that has been drawn so many times, so clearly, so darkly, in media and in news and in conversations, that now it's like a deep groove. And maybe you know the line that I'm talking about. It's this hard line that says either you believe in Scripture or you believe in science. Like it's an ultimatum. Like if you believe in science, you must denounce what Scripture says. And if you believe in Scripture, you must denounce what science says. As a pastor, I have talked with a lot of people for whom this divide has become a faith-shaking obstacle. I know people who have left the Christian faith because of this divide. I know people for whom Christianity is a non-starter, won't even have the conversation because of this perceived divide between science and Scripture. I know Christians who talk about science like it's sorcery. And in every case, it's because somewhere along the line, people have been convinced that the discoveries of science and the revelation of Scripture are mutually exclusive. Like, how did we get here? Was it a big bang or a big God? Are humans the product of evolution or intelligent design? Is our existence accidental or intentional? Haven't the modern scientific discoveries disproven Scripture and therefore Christianity and even God? And maybe you find yourself struggling with these questions. Maybe you find yourself on one side or another of this apparent impasse. But what if, this is what I want to suggest to you today, what if the line of faith in Jesus isn't drawn here at all? What if the discoveries of science and the revelation of Scripture are not as incompatible as people would like you to believe? What if the study of science and the study of Scripture are not contradictory disciplines, but complementary to one another? What if science and Scripture aren't telling different stories, but telling different parts of the same story? Here's what I want to suggest today, that really, science discovers what God has done. Scripture reveals why He did it. And my hope for our talk today is that you will find freedom from this unnecessary, ill-conceived attempt to remove God from science and to remove science from faith. My hope is that you'll begin to look on the discoveries of science with wonder and awe as they reveal the glory of God. And my hope is that you will discover what Scripture reveals about why God did all of this and what that means for you and why you're here. And my prayer is that it will draw you to Him, to worship Him and to trust Him with your life. So let's dive in. So this is an apologetics message, which means we are kind of taking kind of an intellectual, reasoned approach to defending the truths of Christianity. So we'll do a little teaching, but we'll also do a little preaching, a little bit of this and a little bit of that. Feel free to take notes. I think it's helpful to begin with what God says about all of this. The Old Testament tells the story of a man named Job who was really going through it one day. And he believed in God, but he was having a really hard time understanding the world that he was in and the world that he was experiencing. And he didn't see where God was in all of this. And so he had questions, and in the lack of answers to those questions, he began to draw his own conclusions. Well, God did not love the conclusions that he was drawing. And so God spoke to Job, and this is what he said, asking Job some tough questions of his own. He said, "Why do you confuse the issue? Why do you talk?" Rejected, uh, he failed to know what the roots of science are. When we look at it, though, we find science as we know it today. And that their scientific pursuits were motivated by this desire to discover what God. The foundations of the he was a devout Anglican believer, and he was famous for Bacon, who said, "A little science estranges a man from God. A lot of science brings him back." Meaning, keep on looking. A guy named Lord Calvin, who was a devout believer, he said the same thing. He said, if you study Scripture deep enough and long enough, it will force you to believe in God. Calvin was the first to suggest that the age of the earth must be measured in millions and billions of years, not in thousands. Galileo, you've heard of him. He discovered and invented just a million sciencey things. And although he was famous for his battles with the Catholic hierarchy, he was a devout Christian who saw his study of science and his faith in God as complementary. He wrote this to the Bible, which in hundreds of places teaches us how the greatness and the glory of God shine forth marvelously in all his works. God has done, and what science has discovered about it, and then what Scripture reveals about why God has done it. And in tribute to Mr. Olch, let's talk about creation. You see, in the Bible, chapter 1, book 1, it starts out with a poem. The creation story of Genesis 1, it follows all the structure of Hebrew poetry. And as it is the case with all poetry in Scripture, the emphasis and the purpose of this poem is to illustrate meaning, a message, to tell us the significance of it all. It's not what, it's about why. And this makes particular sense when we understand who this poem was first given to. The first audience was the people, Moses and the people of the Hebrew people who were wandering through the desert, living as nomads between Egypt and Canaan. They had escaped from slavery, but they had not yet reached the promised land. And as you can imagine what it would be like wandering through the desert for 40 years, you begin to ask some tough questions. Like, for one, how did we get here? And also, like, what is this all for? They weren't asking, hey, what's the speed of light? And how old is the earth? Which is probably why Genesis 1 doesn't start out with a scientific journal. It starts out with a poem. What they needed to know was meaning. What they needed to know was why. And so God said, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Now the earth was formless and empty. Darkness was over the surface of the deep, and the Spirit of God was hovering over the waters. And God said, let there be light. And there was light. 10 times through the rest of this poem, there's 6 stanzas to this poem, 10 times through this poem, we see this phrase right here, God said. And every time we see it say, God said, what happens is God's voice produces. When God said, his voice produces, 7 of those times, God produces the elements of the universe. He brings forth life. He produces life. He calls it forth, including when God said, let us make mankind in our image. 3 of those 10 times when God said, he was blessing what he had created and giving it purpose. The meaning and the message, the significance of the story of creation as God told it is that, for one, he did it. That he did it all.